science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. It's September 2021 and today I am speaking with Mark Dorrian, who is a profound intellectual and thinker at the University of Edinburgh, whose writings, lectures and pedagogical interventions influenced a complete generation of thinkers, particularly in the UK and Europe. But his influence has now also started to creep across into the US, and it is in that context that I caught up with him a few weeks back, and we have a diverse conversation that begins very appropriately today on the impact of Zoom education, of the COVID virus on architectural education, and more importantly, on architectural thinking. It's a perfect conversation for me to re-listen to as we are attempting to come back into teaching in person, and I hope you find it instructive as well. All right, here we go. All right, Mark, thank you for being on Architecture Talk. Welcome to this conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So you're in Edinburgh. You're still at the University of Edinburgh. Is that where you are? I know you have a wide body of writings, a lot of books. You have engaged a wide circle of fabulous thinkers, and I'm grateful to Mark Jarzombek, my old friend, for connecting us. We could talk about just about anything, I know, from your diversity of interests. But I thought maybe we can enter into a conversation simply by, what I want to talk about is, your response to the pandemic, the vaccine, the change in architecture, architectural thinking that has had, is having, what the future impacts of all this might be, just sort of see where your thinking is on all this. But let me start out simply by asking, you're working from home, I take it, or are you working partially from home? How has all this affected you very materially and specifically?
Yes, thanks, Vikram. Well, at the moment I'm sitting in my office in Edinburgh at the University of Edinburgh. I'm usually working from home at the moment, but I can occasionally come in to use the office and things here. I'm presently involved in teaching a final year Master of Architecture course. So that's one of the studio options in the final years of the professional degree. And I'm teaching a theory course this semester as well as supervising PhD students. So at the moment, I'm sort of mainly preoccupied with questions of just sort of operating within this, or finding the best way to operate within these in this situation in relationship to these different groups of students. Yeah, it's been quite challenging. We've had periods of time, actually last semester, whenever we were able to meet as a group in the university studios, but certainly since the start of the semester, pretty much all the teaching has been done remotely.
Sounds like it has been challenging. Has it been difficult? Has it mostly been a drag, or have you found some interesting things in there?
It has been quite challenging and difficult, I think, and difficult for the students as well, who I think feel rather isolated. Obviously, they don't get access to the normal university facilities and the workshops, and certainly the programme at Edinburgh puts quite a big emphasis normally on the use of the workshops and then making physical things as part of the process. Science studio.
You can't really do that, yeah.
So that's been quite tricky. And of course, as we're getting towards the end of semester now, everybody's feeling a little bit more stressed as well. So it's been, I think it's been quite challenging. It's quite strange because there's I think the interplay between this proximity that we have through these kinds of interfaces that we're talking about at the moment, which in one sense appears to bring us very close. There's a peculiar relationship between that kind of mediated proximity and the condition of life.
I mean, there's this strange Zoom proximity. Now I have people, my friends from all over the world sitting on my reviews suddenly, and I can set up conversations with people like you at a moment's notice. So there's that strange proximity on the one hand. Yeah, but on the other, you feel like it's like cutting something critical out of your relationship with students in particular, or?
Again, it seems strange. It's quite informal in a way, the Zoom relationship. But on the other hand, I think it does format the discussions and the interactions in a particular way. I think it's interesting the way that works. Even very, very basic things like having to pause. There's a slight delay sometimes in the way one sequences what one says. You really notice that in seminars, obviously. If you have a group of students and you really, as an instructor, find yourself, moderating the group much more, I think, than one does in a seminar room. But certainly with design students, I miss very much just the adjacency and the immediacy and the possibility of kind of picking up and discovering things that aren't on the screen that we
right.
Yeah, one misses that kind of dynamic relationship that, in a sense, you don't really think about so much until you're teaching over a screen, or it really brings into focus the kind of background conditions or the dynamics and mobility of that occur in a situation of physical proximity in a crowded room with lots of stuff lying around where you can pick things up and interact.
So this is really an architectural discussion then. I mean, you're talking about physical proximity, interacting with things, the distance between us and students, and time lag can also be said to be really an architectural question. Is this informing your thinking about the nature of, space or architecture as such?
Yeah, I think it tends to reinforce some of the thinking and sort of commitments I always had to certain conditions of architecture,
right.
As it were, dramatizes and foregrounds that. And I think also the way in which, something that has struck me very much is the way in which I'm finding in conversations with students a tendency to place particular limits on what one says in order to just try to establish a kind of clarity in the conversation. So I suppose what I mean by that is that kinds of things that I feel I might say about a project that in a normal situation that I think I could make clear through a process of dialogue or gesturing or drawing or some combination of all these things. I'm finding that I'm not so confident that I could kind of reach that point of clarity across the Zoom interface. I'm finding it actually tends to, it kind of places limits on the way particular kinds of conversation around design projects develop. Yeah, I think that's one of the most striking things I found, actually. There's a kind of, it sort of disciplines what one says a little bit, because
you mean disciplines in the Foucauldian sense, or
yes, yes, that's right. It places particular kinds of limits around what one says, because one has this feeling that the complex forms of communication in a pedagogical architectural setting are just not as complex anymore in this, or at least you have to sort of find other routes.
Yeah. Tends towards oversimplification is what I'm saying, just simply for the purposes of getting something done over the format of Zoom.
That's right, and sometimes the problems are straightforwardly technical ones. I'm finding that the students are very distributed and they have all kinds of
bandwidth,
issues with bandwidth and the asynchronous character of the teaching if they're all, all over the place. But it's, I mean, not to be totally negative about it. I mean, as you say, one of the things that has been very nice is everybody's equipped in a similar way now, and it is possible to have people interacting with reviews and in conversations and seminars in a way that certainly here would have been more unusual before.
Have you taken advantage of that?
Yes, absolutely we have. And we had quite an interesting review at the end of the first semester in which, so about 75% of the students in the group I'm teaching were on campus, and we were able to meet in a large seminar room. Some students were remote. We had two large screens, one at the end of the table. One was given over to remote guests who were appearing on one screen, and the other was given over to the presentation of the work. And that was quite interesting, actually. There was quite a fluid interaction between remote students and remote guests and the critics and students who were in the room. So that seemed quite successful, actually.
Can we delve deeper into the fluidity? Are you glad that it simply worked without disaster, or did you think that there was something interesting beyond that?
Yes, I was glad that it worked without disaster. I mean, there's something inherently quite interesting about different people being situated in different places and at different times, but interacting at the same time around an event, around a kind of common event. I'm not sure what that means in terms of, I'm not sure what's at stake in that. But I suppose one of the things it does tend to do is heighten the sense of the differentials of the different positions, which might be geographical and spatial and temporal, as well as ideological or situational in some sense. I think also it's kind of interesting for students to have an expanded sense of their audience, the audience for their work. It can be an issue, I think, when it feels like, I mean, certainly there are visitors that traditionally pass through schools, but that possibility of having in a very fast way a kind of expanded and in a sense global audience for the work to be presenting out of a context, but into an array of other contexts is kind of interesting, I think, and maybe something about the. I mean, there's all this stuff about Zoom backgrounds. You have all your books behind you, Vikram. My book's the other side.
No, these are real.
Yeah. No, well, that's right. But it is interesting that this means something, right? Because I mean, you immediately at the start you talk about the tangle of wires behind me, and we know about the way that people certainly were very familiar with kind of politicians arranging their background in particular ways to convey particular messages, and it's it's interesting the way these become staged contexts, or I mean, they're whenever there's not much to look at. Whenever the screen is kind of limited.
The backgrounds are interesting,
The background becomes the foreground, in a sense, it gets foregrounded in the...
That's a nice phrasing. Background becomes the foreground. Sort of introduces the theater more actively, in one sense, into the production of conversation. We are always sitting on a stage in that sense. Reality TV kind of assumes a new kind of a dimension in this world. But let's shift to the pandemic. Zoom's one implication of the pandemic, the sort of the normalization of this theatrical spectacle of the Zoom. But what is your thinking as a theorist and design teacher on this? On the sort of this sort of globality of the event, and then moving from there slowly to what do you think will be the lasting effects of this on architectural thinking? Do you think, I have colleagues who are just simply can't wait for it to be over and everything go back to normal and forget that anything happened. What is your thinking about this?
Well, I guess the initial question is what normal looks like after this, and I mean, I suspect it will be a very differentiated and rather complex pattern internationally and globally. I mean, one of the things that's very clear is that the pandemic brings to the fore in complex ways many social inequalities in terms of distributions of power and access to resources, and access to facilities of one kind or another. I mean, we saw that play out in all kinds of ways in relationship to so-called key workers, and also the profiles of those with the highest mortality rates in society. And certainly in the UK, it was very, very clear. There's a lot of political rhetoric about us all being in this together, and obviously in many ways we are all in it together, but we're not equally exposed to the effects and dangers of the.
No doubt.
So now that we're into the to the vaccine stage and the various politics around the vaccine, it will certainly be interesting to see how this plays out in a global sense. I think. I mean, I suspect that the trajectory from here on will look very, very different in different global locations, depending on a variety of things, including access to vaccine uptake, but also the kind of possibilities of sort of modes of life in relation to questions of the ability to social distance, for example, or to adopt particular kinds of behavior. I suppose my sense is that there may be sort of issues around particular rights of movement, vaccine. I think we'll see the ability to move and kind of in a way to prosper in the post-vaccine age being very unequal and differentiated, and I think it will exacerbate many of the existing kind of global inequalities that we find at the moment. So it's hard to whenever somebody mentions mentions eagerness to return to normality, it's difficult to know exactly what that means and what sort of counts as normality for particular individuals. It's also, of course, I mean, there are situations like in Brazil at the moment, looks like it's going to be a massive incubator of mutations of the virus. And again, the way the geopolitics of this plays out is going to be rather interesting, to say the least.
A lot of people are talking about reimagining the office building on account of a lot of people working from home. Certainly in the tech economy right around here in Seattle, there's a lot of conversation around that. All my nephews and younger generations, they're like, I don't know, why should I go back? They're talking about the HVAC systems and how is that to be taught, and the huge elevator banks as suddenly sites of inquisition. Are you hearing any things like that in the UK?
A little bit, and yeah, the whole pattern of real estate and the real estate economy, and the whole the city centre office economy, and the whole series of associated workspaces, spaces that are restaurants, etc., that serve that. Or it's very unclear how that's going to what the centre of London, for example, is going to look like in 5 or 10 years.
Really? What do you mean by that? It's unclear? You feel like it's going to get emptied out?
No, it's already emptied out. And there are a number of major companies, office space holders, who are not anticipating anything like a full return to occupancy of the office space. I mean, their workforce are equipped, they're working from home. Quite a few don't want to return anyway. There may be a certain level of paranoia or anxiety around sort of biosecurity in the office spaces. It's, rents are falling. There's less competition. Obviously, new employers or companies that would have built city centre offices before are now thinking about sort of different ways of that the workforce might be configured. In many ways, it can be economically advantageous for them to do that anyway, because one of the things it does is it displaces many of the real estate infrastructural costs onto the employees, they become domestic costs for the employees, and that hasn't really fully been worked out. Yeah, so there are kind of convergent interests about this. I was hearing a report today saying that during there was a report from a kind of real estate agent who, on one hand, was saying that there's a great interest in people looking to rent and buy in more rural, more dispersed locations, because it's going to be more possible to work from these now than it was before. It turns out that the word garage is the most frequently searched for word in property searches at the moment, because if you
really?
yeah, if you have a garage, I mean, this is in the UK. If you have a garage, you can convert it into an office, so you can work from, you can use it as an office. But on the other hand, there was also a report that certain people are also starting to move. There's been an increased uptake of apartment accommodation in city centres because there's been quite a significant fall in the monthly rental value of rental apartments because of the exodus from the city caused by the COVID situation. So it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of pushing in both ways at the same time.
Are you thinking about how you might weave in any of these conversations into your teaching at Edinburgh?
Yes. Yeah, there's quite a lot of thinking around this at the moment. It's quite a moving target, I think. There's, I guess, one of the open questions is sort of what this means in relationship to climate as well, and in relationship to the climate crisis. The theory course I'm teaching this year is on Sloterdijk, on Peter Sloterdijk, and one of the reasons I wanted to teach that was because there's a kind of an interesting connection between his immunological attitude toward cultures and his immunological theory of culture and the COVID situation, and there have been some quite interesting engagements around that with his work. But I think one of the anxieties or concerns is a sense of sort of loss of social attachment, of kind of solidarity around certain issues that comes from contact in a way, and that comes from shared experience in a place. Who's been I think that's something that I feel very, very strongly about in relationship to design teaching. I mean, it's always seemed to me that architectural teaching is more than a kind of disciplinary teaching. It's like an apprenticeship in citizenship as well, that people come together around shared issues, think together, they work counterpoints one another, they civilize one another in a way, they affect one another, they stimulate one another, and the sort of this isolation that students are feeling at the moment, or the limitations, the thinness of the digital link that we have, I think is something of it's a draining away of many things, but it's a draining away of pleasures, and the pleasures of attachment, the affectivity of engagement, the way we excite and mobilize one another. And I think that these are all, questions of conviviality. They're architectural questions. They're questions of sort of being somewhere, sharing things in particular ways. So the horizon of the prospect of how one sort of thinks through the COVID situation with a view to these concerns as well, I think is very very important for education.
So what do you think Sloterdijk would have said
About the COVID situation?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. In a certain way, I don't know how you describe it in the US, but the typical way of describing sort of protective maneuver in the UK during the sort of periods of lockdown has been through bubbles. You construct COVID bubbles, so you can have kind of relations with.
we use the same term. Who's in your bubble? Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that terminology is there. That sort of Sloterdijkian terminology is there, kind of mobilized in that particular way.
Yeah.
And I think, there is certainly this foregrounding of a kind of an immunological withdrawal in his work, which is also, it's not as straightforward as that, because I think it's much more about, he puts the emphasis on sort of forms of, I suppose, technology through which one mediates relations with others. But there is a certain foregrounding and emphasis on withdrawing and internalization, and in forms of intimacy in the work, which is clearly observable in the current situation, but in a kind of pathological way. So I think an interesting question that comes out of that thinking is what kinds of mediumship we need to deploy in
mediumship.
Mediumship, yes. What kind of mediumship we need to deploy in the current situation? Zoom digital platforms are obviously a certain kind of mediation. Social distancing is a certain kind of mediation. Physical envelopes are certain kinds of mediation as well. But my sense is we need something thicker, something more complex, something more satisfying, or we need to kind of connect these together in different ways. And maybe that example of the review that I talked about was an example of a kind of expanded mediumship in relationship to this, where these things are folded in together in a way, and you start to maybe find. So your question about the fluidity or the dynamics of that situation, maybe partly that sense of fluidity comes from connecting different kinds of mediation together. Sitting in a distanced way around a table, but also having these other forms folded into that as well.
Are you in touch with Sloterdijk? Where is he? I guess he's in Germany.
Yes, he is. Yeah. No, I'm not personally in touch with him. I know people like Gernot Böhme, who works. I don't think he's a philosophical ally of Sloterdijk in any way, but there's a similar concern with atmosphere in the work. But I run a theory course which runs every second semester, and it's called Reading ... So it takes a corpus of work by a particular writer, and each week we look at two texts, which is usually a text by the writer, and then another text which may be explicitly addressed to the text we're reading, or it might just be something that's interesting to read alongside it. And I think it's quite interesting because it allows us to see the development and the transformation of the ideas across the corpus of the work, across a period of time, but also sort of sets up different critical perspectives or engagements with the work. So last week, for example, we looked at, there's an online recording of a debate between Sloterdijk and Bernard Stiegler. Stiegler died very recently, actually. He was at the Beaubourg in Paris.
Oh.
It was held at Nijmegen in the Netherlands around the Anthropocene. And then we kind of read a text in relationship to that. And next week we're looking at atmoterrorism work in relationship to Virilio's bunker archaeology work. So there are different kinds of relationship that we excavate, or at least that we try to develop. But yes.
In a sense, the kind of decline of this kind of critical well, whatever you want to think, critique, a sort of active discourse. At least here in the United States, it feels like that to me. Pragmatism, I think, the discussion about that, and the rise of this, climate and sustainability as the kind of dominant trope of this new pragmatic,
Right.
universal scope. Any thoughts on how this conversation might, it could get just much heightened by the pandemic? Is my feeling. I think that it's going to root itself further deeply into this entire situation rather than question its moorings.
Yeah.
I wonder what you're thinking about that.
Yes, no, I can appreciate that, and I can see that. One narrative or one scenario for the way this could go is that it becomes kind of thematized around issues of securitization.
Mm-hmm.
So the securitization of not everyone, not of a kind of common humanity, but of groups, nations, individuals, and that this this kind of plays into an increasingly divisive and heightened and potentially violent politics, which then turns around relations of exclusion, kind of questions of who gets incorporated and who is on the outside of this. And I can see potential futures like that in relationship to the pandemic, but also in relationship to climatic conditions and climatic enclosure or engineering. I mean, you can see quite clearly scenarios like this growing out of potential geoengineering projects, but also out of vaccine nationalist conditions as well, and
Yeah.
and also the the transformations in specific environments that might be wrought by by climate change. So yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's a real danger, and in a sense, that, I mean, to me, that is absolutely something that we have to fight in a way for a universal response to a universal problem, as opposed to a response that looks more like an archipelago of fixes in relationship to a universal problem, which actually heightens the tensions around this.
Right. But also I'm thinking, just in schools of architecture and the conversations that we are having, and what we are teaching, and there's sort of a battle between the technologist sustainability kind of worldview and the kind of thinking that you are trying to outline in your seminar, where there is a text and then there is a sort of a discourse around it, and then there is a conversation between texts and over time and how they change, and even the act of reading them today, and then what that means. And there's this whole culture of how to, you're calling it reading ... or thinking ... or writing ... or writing ... right? I'm trying to find ways over here, where I am teaching at the University of Washington in Seattle, to basically make a stronger case for the significance of that kind of pedagogy.
Yeah.
And it used to be, the argument was that, the discipline of architecture has become so diverse. We've got to account for everything from land use to zoning to watersheds, from water closets to watersheds, right? And the entire sociality around it, so that it makes for the seminar room to be the critical place where we can think, where all information is available through an online search. Then it's really about thinking. So, kind of mental gymnastics that you are, I imagine, running your students through becomes important. But I fear a backlash against that around the corner. a kind of a return, a stronger return to not phobia. What is the opposite of philia, I suppose?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Do you feel the same way?
I can see that. Yes, I mean, I can see I can see that we may be pushed in that. So, I mean, we see this. I think we see this sort of happening already around things like geoengineering discourses that I just mentioned, where the sense is that because of the difficulty of sort of liberal democracies of coming to pulling back in certain ways from resource expenditure or shifting their patterns of consumption of resources, etc., that it seems to push things in the direction of technological fixes. And as the emergency seems to become heightened, this puts pressure on that again. And all of a sudden, university contexts, one has this heightened rhetoric of emergency, and the university responding in very instrumental ways, I suppose, to the situation in some way. But and I can that's with us already. I can absolutely see that. But I guess if one has an attitude to a kind of critical approach to pedagogy, or one has a commitment to pedagogy itself, a kind of critical project, I suppose one's always trying to do is through one's engagements with the students is to not just convey or teach or share something, but also give the students the resources to get underneath, as it were, and understand the structural conditions of their own education. So I feel quite strongly about this sense of a kind of double vision that one has. One's involved in course materials and reading things and engaging in discussions and projects that are set, but one is always at the same time thinking about why am I looking at this and not that? What are the kind of decisions that have led to or the kinds of commitments that have led to this education looking the way that it does? Yeah, so a pedagogy that tries to equip students with those kinds of resources and constantly, it's also constantly asking them to reflect upon that, I think is really very crucial and maybe more important than ever in the current situation, when there is so much, when rhetorics of emergency rise and there are demands to act and to act in particular ways, one has to be able to think through these, to take a reflective position on them, and to understand that what is being demanded is not the only way, and what is being demanded might, and to be able to articulate that as well. I mean, I guess this is the other thing that I would want to say, that architectural training has always seemed to me, I mean, I've said it before, a kind of training in citizenship as well. What I think makes architecture such an interesting subject to be in is that, or to think about, or thing to think about, is the fact that it's at the intersection of so many different kinds of interests and forces, that it's about material and ways that we live, it's about economics, it's about environment, it's about philosophy, it's about sanitation and health, it's about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's where many things are negotiated and come into contact. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's also one of the things that many other thinkers who are not specifically in architecture have recourse to as a particular kind of thought experiment, or a particular kind of, it's a very special kind of symbolic side, architecture. So many philosophers speak about architecture, and that's, there's a reason for that, I think. So I'm sort of interested, I think one of the things that we should think about as well, and this is also maybe interesting in connection to the COVID question you brought up, Vikram, is that thinking of architecture not obviously it's about the design of buildings and the design of structures, cities, etc., but it's also a kind of site of thought, and I think Susan, is something that I would really want to emphasize, that it's a side of kind of cultural thinking and inquiry and speculation, which goes far beyond the discipline and practice of architecture itself, and engages many, many other areas of cultural and technical inquiry as well, and maintaining a interactive, dynamic and effective interrelation between all these things. Tend to become specialized, divided out and secured in particular ways, and I think that can be reinforced by the way universities are funded and the funding regimes, the possibility of acquiring funding to undertake particular kinds of projects and of capitalizing upon that in certain ways. And this can be very kind of it can produce certain kinds of silo effects, but can also lead to very a kind of severing of conversations and relations that are really important, I think, for the effective understanding and kind of cultural understanding of the various endeavors that we undertake in School of Architecture. So fostering that architecture is a nexus and of multiple interests and concerns and approaches, and fostering the connectivity between these and constantly sort of seeking to articulate the relations that we find here, I think is really, really, really fundamental.
Yeah, no, architecture is a site of thinking rather than a sort of a site of a technological fix. It's certainly a vision or a field that I would totally subscribe to. As we are almost ready to conclude here, do you think that that's unique to us? Or do you think a lot of other disciplines would like to imagine themselves doing the same thing?
In a certain way, I would say yes, it is unique. I mean, I think it's unique in the particular kinds of relations that it supports that aren't simply matched or found somewhere else. But all disciplines have their complexity and their their field, in the sense of the kind of forces and interests and concerns and areas of investigation that can that they hold together. So I would sort of particularly want to declare that architecture is sort of preeminent in this, but I think it has a specificity and is particular. And I think, actually, to be honest, I think as architects we encounter that all the time. I mean, just to give one example that's sort of close to home in a sense. I mean, the architecture school here is part of a college of art as well, and I'm quite involved with, and have been quite involved with, art discourses and sometimes with the examination of art practice work and PhDs by art practice. And it's often struck me how architecture students have an obligation to explain their work in a way that art students don't. So the art students, I mean, the point is, in a sense, not to explain the work. The work is
right
there, and it doesn't have to be accounted for. It doesn't have to be. I mean, this is it.
That doesn't fly in an architecture jury.
No. Whereas architects constantly have to articulate what they do and explain themselves. And it's interesting the way that happens, and it happens in complex ways. But they have to make appeals to other things. Artists just have to appeal to the work, or the work is its own appeal. It finishes there. I remember the first PhD by art practice that I was asked to examine as an external examiner. When I went along, so the artist had produced an exhibition and a written commentary, critical commentary on it as well. And I was told in the briefing beforehand that I could, in my response, I could request amendments or corrections to be made in the written commentary, but I couldn't ask for the work to be corrected.
Is that right?
But at the same time, by creative practice, the work was the mode of research. So I said, So what kind of examination is this then? That really sort of underlined that kind of, let's say, that commitment to a kind of status that the work has. So one could say that operates through a kind of cutting off or severing of the work's in order to make it autonomous in some way, or to make it something just in itself. Whereas for the architects, their work is always a crossing point. It's always a crossing point they have to articulate and explain.
Yeah, and we love inviting just everybody on the review.
Right, that's right, everybody. Everybody,
yeah, indeed. That is the joy of architectural thinking. Mark, it's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you for taking the time out.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.